We are following developments between the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine after President Trump called Russian President Vladimir Putin, quote, absolutely crazy for his latest actions in the war on Ukraine. That comment coming after Moscow has launched 3 straight nights of drone strikes, the largest aerial assault so far of the 3-year war. At least 12 people have been killed. Trump posting that Putin is needlessly killing a lot of people and warning that if he tries to conquer all of Ukraine, it will lead to Russia's downfall. The Kremlin firing back this morning, accusing Trump of, quote, emotional overload. But Trump also had some criticism for Ukrainian president after Volodymyr Zelensky accused the U.S. of silence following this weekend's attacks. Trump said that, quote, everything's out of Zelensky's mouth causes problems. I don't like it, and it better stop, he said. CNN's Kevin Liptak joins me now from the White House. We are seeing a major shift in tone from President Trump when it comes to Putin, but a very similar tone when it comes to Zelensky. Tell us more about what you're learning.
Yeah, and these comments about Putin, I think, are very significant for a president who more often than not is offering a conciliatory message towards the Russian president. These comments really stood out, and I think the timing here is quite notable. You know, it was only 1 week ago that President Trump and President Putin spoke on the telephone. Afterwards, the president essentially taking Putin at his word that he's still interested in a peace agreement, despite Putin maintaining all of these maximalist demands to end the war. Now the president adopting quite a harsh tone towards the leader in Moscow. Listen to what the president said.
I'm not happy with what Putin's doing. He's killing a lot of people, and I don't know what the hell happened to Putin. I've known him a long time, always gotten along with him, but he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all, okay? We're in the middle of talking, and he's shooting rockets into Kiev and other cities. I don't like it at all.
Now, this notion that Putin has changed somehow, that the man that Trump is dealing with today is not the same man he was dealing with in his first term, is something that European leaders have been warning Trump about really for months, but so long he hadn't necessarily been internalizing that point of view. Now, I think the question is how Trump moves forward. You know, there is not a lot of evidence that Putin really cares what Trump or any other world leader thinks or is saying about him. The question is all about action. Does, for example, the president apply new sanctions on Russia? He said yesterday that absolutely he was willing to do that, but he has also been saying for months that this is on the table, but so far he's stopped short of putting any new measures onto Moscow. There's also a question of what's left to sanction in Russia that could potentially have any effect on this war. There's also a question of whether President Trump will send new military assistance to Ukraine. You know, he has not approved any new military assistance packages to Ukraine since taking office. He hasn't spent the roughly $4 billion that remains of what Congress has authorized. Based on his comments yesterday about Zelensky, it's not clear that he's willing to go that route. Or this third option, which I think is perhaps more likely based on what the president's saying, does he continue to try and absolve himself of any responsibility for trying to end this conflict? He did suggest after that phone call with Putin that it would be up to Putin and Zelensky to come up with any solution. And he said last night that this is a war that is Zelensky, Putin's, and Biden's wars, not Trump's, and that he was only helping to put out the big and ugly fires. Sarah.
Kevin Liptak, with a mouthful, a lot going on there. Thank you so much. Erica?
Well, with this new wave of deadly Russian strikes combined with the comments from President Trump in the Kremlin this morning, could this mean that any hope of a ceasefire is now even further away? CNN's Nick Robertson joining us now. So, Nick, the comments from President Zelensky talking about the silence on the part of the U.S. encouraging Putin, some of the most direct remarks that he has made, not sitting perhaps well. What does this do to any potential talks?
Look, I think the reality is that the potential talks were talks. They weren't a reality and a real immediate path to a meaningful ceasefire. President Putin has been offered that. In fact, President Trump has told him over more than the past 2 months that he wants him to agree to an unconditional ceasefire the same way that Ukraine has. And Putin has punted that, has kicked the can down the road. But what we've witnessed this weekend is a very, very clear message coming from the Kremlin. You have the Kremlin spokesman today, not just accusing President Trump of emotional overload, but stating very, very clearly that President Putin makes decisions that are in Russia's national security and interest. And what that meant was, on Friday, despite the fact that there was underway 3 days of the biggest prisoner exchange so far, which incidentally Friday President Trump hinted that this may be the path to something much bigger, hinting that the path to peace may be open. What does President Putin do on Friday evening? A 250 missile and drone salvo into Ukraine, killing 13 people, then doubles down on that Saturday into Sunday, 367 missiles and drones. That's the biggest number ever since the war began. And then last night, after President Trump has spoken and criticizing Putin, calling him going crazy, Putin then launches 355 drones into Ukraine, which is the biggest drone attack so far since the war. So the message is very, very clear, and dare one say even consistent, coming from the Kremlin. That is, they're not engaging on the narrative for peace, not in a meaningful way. They're kicking around the edges of it, and in the meantime, kicking Ukraine. And if there's anywhere where there are emotions, they're very raw in Ukraine, particularly with the people who've fallen victim over this weekend. One woman who's sort of standing in the rubble of the remains of her property said, "I wish President Trump was here to see this." So it's not just President Zelensky hoping that President Trump really gets a clear-eyed view of what's happening in Ukraine. It's the Ukrainian citizens as well. And yes, they do want US help, and there will be a hope that perhaps President Trump's comments now about Putin mark a significant change. I'm not sure if anyone's holding their breath in Ukraine, though.
So in the wake of Russia's deadly aerial attack on Ukraine overnight, its largest since the war began, US President Donald Trump issued a strong rebuke of his Russian counterpart, saying Putin has gone absolutely crazy. And now the US president says he will absolutely consider sanctions. So if he does that, how might additional sanctions change the direction of this war?
Well, let's see if he actually does that, because he's said that many times in the past and done nothing. It's also notable that in that statement that he also attacked Zelensky for having the nerve to be the victim of Russian aggression. And I think that I'm skeptical that Trump will actually put in sanctions. But if he did, then it would be secondary sanctions designed to undermine Russia's access to oil and energy supplies, to drive up, to reduce the cost of oil and energy supplies, undermine the Russian economy, undermine their ability to sustain a wartime economy, and that would be a positive step. But I am dubious that he'll actually do anything on this occasion.
So, Malcolm, what is the situation on the battlefield right now? How vulnerable is Ukraine, and how strong militarily is Russia right now?
Well, essentially what you're seeing is Russia making creeping, grinding progress in the central eastern area near Donbass, around Pokrovsk and Dnipro. They're slowly taking more territory, though at great cost in terms of lives lost. They've also got a force that they've built up in Belarus that potentially could be used to open up a second front towards Kharkiv. That, if that happens, then that could undermine Ukraine's ability to sustain their forces and sustain their defense in the eastern area around Pokrovsk. So I do think the Russians are getting set for a summer offensive. They will not find it easy to take territory, but it largely does depend on whether the West continues to support Ukraine. I think Europe will, but I'm not so certain about the United States. If the Trump administration does walk away from the Ukraine war, as they've suggested they might, then the question must be asked is, do they cancel out any military aid and intelligence sharing? That would then put Ukraine in a very difficult situation indeed. They will then have to withdraw from certain areas and abandon them to the Russians.
And of course, you touched on this, but President Trump has been sending mixed messages to Putin, hasn't he? First pledging to end the war, then suggesting it's not his war, and now showing surprise that Putin is still launching deadly attacks on civilians. What message does that wavering message from Donald Trump send to Putin in the midst of his war on Ukraine?
Look, I think it's inconceivable that Trump didn't know that Putin was launching these devastating attacks on Ukrainian cities, which, after all, have been going on really since the beginning of the war, and certainly have intensified since the Trump administration came to power. So I think this notion that somehow President Trump is surprised and that Putin has gone crazy is farcical. I think that Trump is just trying to avoid making some hard decisions about how far he goes to penalize Russia, if any, in any way, in terms of whether he does anything at all. And I think that it's the messages, though, that it's sending to Putin from Trump is one of weakness and lack of resolve. The fact that Trump is not prepared to actually impose cost on Russia is being received by Putin in Moscow, and I have to say by Xi Jinping in Beijing, that the US president lacks resolve, is weak and unwilling to stand up to a threat. So this is rather a cause for concern in the broader scheme of growing strategic risk around the world.